Some doors don't open when you knock. They open when something remembers you. The bell rang once, then twice, then a third time, clear and steady through the cold November rain. Even though Ethan Cole stood 20 feet away from the porch and no hand had touched it. He paused beside his old pickup, breath fogging in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, his instincts tightening the way they used to before something shifted out of place. Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, stopped beside him mid-step, ears high, body rigid, amber eyes locked onto the weathered house at the end of the gravel road. The place looked forgotten, its paint peeled to gray, its windows dark as if they had long stopped expecting light. But there was something else, something quieter, like the air itself was holding its breath. "You hear that, boy?" Ethan murmured, though he already knew Ranger had heard more than sound. The dog let out a low, uncertain rumble, not fear, not warning, something deeper, like recognition. Rain tapped softly against the hood of the truck as Ethan stepped forward, boots crunching over damp gravel, each step slower than the last. The bell didn't ring again, but the silence it left behind felt louder than any noise. Ranger moved ahead now, pulling slightly, guiding more than following, his nose lifting to the wind, as if tracing a scent that wasn't there a moment ago. The porch creaked under Ethan's weight as he climbed the steps, the old wood sighing beneath him like it had been waiting too long to carry someone again. Up close, the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying just enough to whisper against its frame with each faint gust of wind. He reached out, hesitated for half a second, then pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of cedar and something older, like time itself had settled into the walls. "Hello." His voice came out low, respectful, as if he had stepped into a place that didn't belong to him. Ranger moved past him without hesitation, nails clicking softly against the worn wooden floor, then stopped halfway down the narrow hallway. His body stiffened again, head tilting slightly as if listening to a distant rhythm Ethan couldn't hear. Then came the sound. A soft shift. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to ripple through the quiet. Ethan felt it more than heard it, a subtle tremor beneath his boots, like the house itself had exhaled after holding something in for too long. Ranger let out a sharp bark, one single note that cut through the stillness, and darted forward. "Easy." Ethan followed quickly, heart picking up, not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. At the end of the hall, a narrow room opened to the right, its door half closed. Ranger pushed through first. Ethan stepped in behind him and saw her. An elderly woman lay on the floor beside a fallen shelf, her silver hair spread softly against the worn boards, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. Her eyes opened slowly as Ethan knelt beside her, and for a moment, something passed between them that felt older than either of them could explain. Her lips moved, voice barely above a whisper. "You came, just like I knew you would." Ethan stilled, the words settling deeper than they should have, while behind him, Ranger turned his head toward the far corner of the room, staring at a single spot on the floor, unmoving, as if the real story hadn't even begun yet. The old woman's hand was colder than Ethan expected, but her grip held a quiet strength, the kind that did not come from the body but from something that had been waiting too long to let go. "Easy now," he said gently, sliding one arm beneath her shoulders and lifting just enough to free her from the weight of the fallen shelf. The wood shifted with a soft scrape, lighter than it looked, as if time had already taken most of its burden. Ranger stood close, watching every movement, his tail low but steady, his eyes not on the woman, but still fixed on that same corner of the room, as if something unseen lingered there. Ethan helped her sit upright against the wall, brushing dust from her coat with careful hands. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked. She shook her head slowly, her breathing shallow but steady, her gaze never leaving his face. "No, just took a fall," she whispered, though there was a faint smile beneath the strain, as if the fall had been expected, almost arranged. Outside, the rain softened into a quiet drizzle, tapping gently against the windows like a distant memory. Ethan reached for a nearby chair and pulled it closer, settling her into it with slow, deliberate care. The room around them felt still, not empty, but full of something unspoken, like a story that had paused mid-sentence. Ranger moved then, stepping toward the far corner, nails clicking softly, and lowered his nose to the floor. He inhaled once, deeply, then pawed lightly at a single plank. Not scratching, not digging, just a precise, deliberate touch. Ethan noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it, boy?" The dog did not bark this time. He simply looked back, ears angled forward, waiting. The woman followed Ethan's gaze, her expression shifting in a way that was almost too subtle to catch, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps acceptance. "He knows," she said quietly. Ethan turned back to her. "Knows what?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she lifted her trembling hand and rested it over his, her skin thin and cool, her voice barely above the hush of the room. "Some things do not forget where they belong." The words settled between them like dust in still air. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but the strange pull of familiarity, like hearing a song he did not remember learning. He glanced again at Ranger, who had now pressed his paw more firmly against the floorboard, as if marking it. The wood gave the faintest creak beneath the pressure, a hollow sound that did not match the rest of the house. Ethan exhaled slowly. "There is something under there," he said, more to himself than to her. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if the statement had confirmed something she had already known. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not until it is time." Ethan studied her face, lined with years but calm in a way that did not match the situation. Most people would have been shaken, confused, asking questions. She did neither. Instead, she looked at him like someone who had finally reached the end of a long road. Ranger stepped back from the plank, but he did not leave it. He simply sat beside it, watchful, patient. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle into place, quiet but undeniable. He did not understand what was happening, not fully, but he knew one thing with certainty. He had not come to this house by accident, and neither had the dog. The rain faded completely by the time Ethan helped her settle near the small fireplace, where a faint glow of embers still held warmth like a memory refusing to go out. He added a few pieces of wood from a nearby crate, careful and quiet, the way he had learned to move in places where noise carried meaning. The fire caught slowly, a soft crackle filling the room, and for the first time since stepping inside, the house felt less like it was holding its breath. The old woman watched him with steady eyes, her hands folded gently in her lap, her breathing evening out as the warmth returned. Ranger remained by the loose floorboard, but his posture had changed. He was no longer tense. Now he waited, calm and certain, like a sentry who had found what he was meant to guard. Ethan glanced at him, then back at her. "You live here alone?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "For a long time now." Her voice carried no sadness, only acceptance, like someone who had made peace with silence. The firelight danced across the walls, revealing small details Ethan had not noticed before. Old photographs lined a narrow shelf, their edges worn, their images faded into soft outlines of faces and places long gone. A wooden clock hung crooked near the doorway, its hands frozen at a time that no longer mattered. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt remembered. Ethan stepped closer to the shelf, drawn by something he could not quite explain. One photograph caught his eye. A younger version of the woman stood beside a man in uniform, his posture straight, his expression calm, his eyes carrying the same quiet weight Ethan had seen in the mirror more times than he could count. Ethan leaned in slightly, his breath slowing. "Who was he?" he asked. The woman followed his gaze, her expression softening. "Someone who once believed he had more time than he did." Ethan said nothing. There was something familiar in the way the man stood, something in the angle of his shoulders, the stillness in his eyes. Not the same face, not the same life, but something deeper, something shared. Ranger shifted slightly, letting out a low breath, and tapped the floor once with his paw. Not urgent, just enough. Ethan turned back toward him, the quiet pull returning. "You keep looking there," he said softly. The woman's eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them again, they carried a gentle clarity. "That place," she said, her voice steady now, "has been waiting longer than I have." Ethan felt a faint chill pass through him, though the fire burned steadily beside them. "Waiting for what?" he asked. She looked at him, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of knowing that did not need to explain itself. "For the right hands," she replied. The words settled into the room, soft but immovable. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting once more to the floorboard, to Ranger, to the quiet certainty in the dog's posture. Outside, the clouds began to part, and a thin line of moonlight slipped through the window, stretching across the floor until it rested exactly where Ranger sat. The wood beneath it seemed almost to shift in the light, not moving, but revealing itself. Ethan took a step forward, drawn without resistance now, his hand lowering instinctively toward the plank. Behind him, the woman's voice came again, softer than before, but clear enough to stop him. Not tonight. He paused, his fingers hovering just inches above the surface. The moment lingered, suspended between action and restraint. Then slowly, he pulled his hand back. Ranger did not move. He only watched, as if he understood something Ethan was still learning. The house settled around them, quiet and patient, like it had all the time in the world. And somewhere deep within its walls, something unseen seemed to wait just a little longer. Morning arrived quietly, not with sunlight bursting through the windows, but with a soft gray glow that filtered gently into the room, as if the day itself was careful not to disturb what had begun the night before. Ethan woke in the chair where he had drifted off, the fire now reduced to a bed of faintly glowing embers, their warmth lingering just enough to hold back the chill. For a moment, he did not move. The stillness felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, like something unseen had made peace with his presence. Ranger was already awake. He sat exactly where he had been the night before, beside the loose floorboard, posture steady, eyes alert, as if he had kept watch through every passing hour. Ethan let out a slow breath and pushed himself to his feet, his joints stiff but his mind clear. The old woman sat near the window, wrapped in a faded shawl, her silhouette outlined by the pale morning light. She had not moved far, but something about her seemed quieter, more distant, like a candle nearing the end of its burn without losing its glow. "You should not have stayed in that chair," she said softly without turning. "There is a room down the hall." Ethan gave a faint, almost amused exhale. "I have slept in worse places," he replied. She nodded slightly, as if that answer told her more than he intended. For a while, neither of them spoke. The house carried a gentle rhythm now, the faint creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind brushing against the walls, the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the trees. It felt less like a structure and more like something alive, breathing slowly, aware. Ethan stepped toward the small kitchen area and found a kettle resting on the stove. He filled it with water from the sink and lit the burner with practiced ease. The simple act grounded him, brought him back to something ordinary, something real. Behind him, Ranger shifted, his nails tapping once against the floor, not in urgency, but in acknowledgement. Ethan glanced back and saw the dog watching him, then the floor, then him again. A silent reminder. The kettle began to hum softly, the sound building in a slow, steady rise. Ethan poured the water into 2 worn mugs he found on a shelf, adding a bit of loose tea from a tin beside them. He carried 1 cup over to her and placed it gently in her hands. She accepted it with a small nod, her fingers wrapping around the warmth as if it anchored her to the moment. "You move like someone who knows how to stay," she said after a while. Ethan looked down at his own hands, then back at her. "Or someone who never learned how to leave," he answered. She smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile that held both understanding and something unspoken. Ranger stood then, slowly, stretching before stepping once more onto the same plank. This time, the wood responded differently. A soft, hollow tone echoed beneath his weight, clearer now in the quiet of morning. Ethan heard it. Immediately, he set his cup aside and walked toward the spot, his movements measured, deliberate. The air around that corner felt slightly cooler, though no draft could be seen. He crouched, placing his hand flat against the wood. The surface was worn smooth, but beneath it, there was space. Not imagined, not guessed, real. Behind him, the woman's voice came again, softer than before, but carrying a quiet certainty that settled deeper than any command. "Today," she said gently, "the house will remember." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the faint echo beneath his palm, like a distant heartbeat returning after a long silence. When he opened them again, Ranger was watching him, not waiting anymore, but ready. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan did not hesitate. The moment Ethan pressed his palm firmly against the floor, the house answered with a sound so subtle it might have been mistaken for imagination if not for the way Ranger immediately leaned closer, ears forward, body aligned with the unseen space beneath them. The wood gave slightly under pressure, not weak, but willing, like something that had been waiting for this exact touch. Ethan ran his fingers along the edges of the plank, tracing the fine seam that separated it from the others. It was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. "There is a latch here," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Ranger shifted, placing his paw just beside Ethan's hand, as if confirming the spot. The old woman did not move from her chair, but her presence filled the room in a quiet, steady way, like a witness who had already seen how this would unfold. Ethan reached for the small utility knife clipped to his belt, sliding the blade gently into the seam. He worked slowly, carefully, not forcing anything, letting the wood respond instead of resisting it. After a few moments, there was a soft click. Not loud, not mechanical, but precise. The kind of sound that carried intention. Ethan paused, listening, his breath held without realizing it. The house remained still, but the air seemed to shift, as if something beneath the floor had acknowledged him. He set the knife aside and placed both hands on the plank, lifting it with steady pressure. The board rose smoothly, lighter than expected, revealing a dark opening just beneath. Cool air drifted upward, carrying a faint scent of aged metal and something else, something older, like paper that had waited too long to be read. Ranger leaned forward but did not cross the threshold. Instead, he sat back on his haunches, watching, his role now no longer to find, but to guard. Ethan reached for a nearby lantern, its glass slightly fogged with age, and lit it with a match from the kitchen. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm, steady glow that pushed back the shadows just enough to reveal what lay below. A narrow space, about 3 feet deep, carefully constructed, not crude or hidden in panic, but built with purpose. Inside sat a single metal box, rectangular, weathered but intact, its surface marked with faint scratches and the passage of time. Ethan lowered the lantern slightly, letting the light settle over it. There were no markings, no labels, nothing that explained why it was there or who had placed it. And yet, it did not feel forgotten. It felt preserved. He reached down slowly, his hand hovering just above the lid, the same hesitation returning, not from fear, but from the sense that this moment carried more weight than the simple act of opening a box. Behind him, the woman's voice came softly, steady despite its quietness. "It was never meant to be hidden forever," she said. Ethan glanced back at her. "What is it?" he asked. She met his gaze, her eyes clear, almost relieved. "A memory," she replied, "that needed the right hands to be understood." Ethan turned back, his fingers finally resting on the cool metal surface. The box was heavier than it looked when he lifted it from its resting place, solid, grounded, like it carried more than its physical weight. He set it gently on the floor beside the opening, the lantern light dancing across its edges. Ranger moved closer now, sitting beside Ethan, his presence calm, unwavering. The room fell into a deeper quiet, the kind that does not demand attention but holds it completely. Ethan placed his hand on the lid, feeling the faint chill of the metal seep into his skin. He did not open it yet. Not immediately. Because something inside him understood what the house had been waiting for all along. Not just for the box to be found, but for someone to be ready to receive what it carried. For a long moment, Ethan did not move, his hand resting on the cold metal as if he could feel something through it, something faint but steady, like the echo of a heartbeat that did not belong to him alone. The room seemed to lean inward, not physically, but in presence, as though the walls themselves were listening. Ranger sat close at his side, his breathing slow and even, his gaze fixed not on the box, but on Ethan, as if the next step had always been his to choose. The old woman watched from her chair, her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested the waiting was finally over. Ethan exhaled slowly and lifted the lid. The hinges gave a soft, measured sound, not rusty, not forced, but deliberate, as if they had been opened many times in memory, if not in years. Inside, the contents were simple at first glance. No gold, no immediate sign of wealth, Just a stack of neatly bound letters, a small leather journal worn at the edges, and beneath them, a folded piece of cloth that carried a faded insignia barely visible in the lantern light. Ethan reached in carefully, lifting the journal first. The leather was soft with age, the pages within slightly yellowed but preserved with care. He opened it slowly, the paper whispering under his fingers. The handwriting inside was steady, deliberate, written by someone who had taken their time, who had chosen each word with purpose. Ranger shifted slightly, leaning closer, his nose brushing the edge of Ethan's sleeve, not interrupting, just present. Ethan began to read, his eyes scanning the first page, then the next, his brow tightening slightly as recognition stirred in a place he could not immediately name. Dates stretched back decades. Entries describing moments of ordinary life intertwined with something deeper, something tied to service, to sacrifice, to choices that had shaped more than one life. He turned another page and paused. There, pressed between the lines of ink, was a name. Not his own, but close enough to make his breath catch. The same last name. Not common. Not something easily dismissed as coincidence. Ethan lowered the journal slightly, his gaze lifting toward the old woman. She met his eyes with quiet understanding. No surprise, no urgency. You were starting to see it, she said softly. Ethan looked. Back down, his fingers tracing the edge of the page. He reached for the folded cloth next, lifting it carefully. As it opened, the insignia became clearer. A military patch, worn but intact, bearing a symbol he knew well. His unit. Not similar. The same. Ethan felt the air shift around him again. Not colder, not heavier, but clearer, like something that had been blurred was finally coming into focus. He set the cloth aside gently and reached for the letters. The top one was sealed, its envelope aged but unbroken, his name written across the front in careful, patient script. Ethan Cole. His hand stilled. Ranger's ears lifted slightly, his body leaning forward just a fraction, as if he, too, understood the weight of what lay in that simple line of ink. Ethan did not open the letter immediately. Instead, he held it there, feeling the quiet gravity of it settle into his chest. Behind him, the woman's voice came one more time, softer now, but filled with a kind of peace that had nothing left to prove. Some kindness, she said, takes years to find its way home. The fire beside them gave a soft crackle, the lantern flamed steady, the house no longer waiting, but watching. And in that stillness, Ethan understood that whatever was written inside that envelope had already begun to change everything. The envelope felt lighter than Ethan expected, but the weight it carried settled deep in his chest, steady and undeniable, as if the moment itself had been waiting far longer than the paper that held it. He turned it slowly in his hands, studying the careful strokes of his name, written with a patience that spoke of certainty, not guesswork. Ranger shifted closer, his shoulder brushing against Ethan's knee, a quiet grounding presence that reminded him he was not alone in whatever this was becoming. The house remained still, the fire low but warm, the air carrying that same sense of quiet attention. Ethan slid his thumb beneath the edge of the envelope and opened it with deliberate care, preserving even the smallest detail, as though respect mattered here. Inside was a single letter, folded neatly, the paper slightly thicker than the journal pages, preserved with intention. He unfolded it slowly, the soft sound of paper filling the room like the turning of something unseen. His eyes moved across the first line, and then he stopped, not because he did not understand the words, but because something within them reached deeper than logic. If you are reading this, then the house chose correctly. Ethan's breath slowed, his focus narrowing as the rest of the room seemed to fade just enough for the words to stand alone. He continued reading, each sentence revealing not just information, but memory, connection, something that bridged time in a way he had never experienced. The letter spoke of a soldier, decades ago, a man who had been pulled from the edge of loss by someone who expected nothing in return. A moment of kindness, brief and unrecorded by history, but not forgotten by the one who received it. Ethan's grip tightened slightly as he read on, the details sharpening. The place, the weather, the circumstances. They aligned too closely with stories he had heard growing up, fragments told in quiet conversations that never seemed important at the time. His grandfather. The name surfaced slowly, then fully, like something rising from deep water. The letter confirmed it without ever needing to say it directly. The man who had been saved had carried that moment forward, building a life shaped by gratitude, passing down not just memory, but intention. And somewhere along the way, that intention had been guided here. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, his eyes lifting toward the woman. She was watching him, her expression peaceful, her shoulders relaxed, as if the final piece had fallen into place exactly as it should. "He never forgot," she said softly. Ethan looked back at the letter, the words continuing, explaining how the house, the box, the preserved memories had all been part of something larger than inheritance, something quieter but far more enduring. Not a reward, not a transaction, a return. Ranger exhaled softly, settling beside him, his presence steady as the truth unfolded. Ethan reached the final lines, his voice barely above a whisper as he read them aloud. "Kindness does not disappear. It travels. It waits. And when the time is right, it finds its way back." The room seemed to hold that sentence, letting it settle into the walls, into the floor, into the space beneath where the box had rested for so many years. Ethan folded the letter carefully, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he understood that nothing about this moment was accidental. He placed it back into the envelope, but not to put it away. To keep it. To carry it forward. Ranger lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's, calm and knowing. And for the first time since stepping into the house, Ethan did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like someone who had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. The letter remained in Ethan's hands long after he had finished reading it, not because he needed to read it again, but because something inside him was still catching up to what it meant. The fire had burned lower, the room settling into a softer light, and for a while, no one spoke. Ranger rested beside him, his head lowered but his eyes open, watchful in that quiet, steady way that had always meant more than simple attention. Ethan finally folded the letter with care and placed it back into the envelope, then set it gently on top of the metal box, as though it belonged there, at least for now. He looked up at the old woman, his expression no longer uncertain, but searching in a different way. "You knew," he said quietly. She nodded, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the morning light had grown warmer, stretching across the floor in long, pale lines. "Not everything," she answered, "but enough to recognize when the waiting was over." Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his mind moving through pieces of memory that had once felt disconnected. Stories his grandfather used to tell, moments he had never fully understood, now settling into place with a clarity that felt almost unreal. "Why me?" he asked, not out of doubt, but from the weight of the answer he sensed was coming. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes soft but certain. "Because you did not stop being who you are, even when the world gave you reasons to." The words landed gently, but they carried more truth than anything else he had heard. Ranger lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, his ears flicking once before settling again. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering to the box once more. It no longer felt like something hidden or mysterious. It felt like something entrusted. He reached for the remaining contents, lifting one of the letters beneath. The top envelope. This one was older, its edges more worn, its seal already broken. He opened it carefully and began to read. The handwriting matched the journal, steady and patient, but the tone was different. More personal, more immediate. It spoke of building something meant to last beyond one lifetime, not in wealth alone, but in purpose. It described the house, not as property, but as a place meant to receive those who needed it most, those who had nowhere else to go, those who carried stories too heavy to hold alone. Ethan paused, his fingers tightening slightly around the paper. He looked up at the room again, really seeing it now. The worn furniture, the careful repairs, the small details that spoke of years of quiet care. This had never been just a home. It had been waiting to become something more. Ranger stood then, slowly, and walked toward the doorway, glancing back once to make sure Ethan followed. Not urgent, not insistent, just a gentle pull forward. Ethan rose to his feet, the letter still in his hand, and followed him down the narrow hall. Each step felt different now, not cautious, but grounded, as if the house itself recognized him in return. Ranger stopped near the front door, sitting beside it, his posture calm. Ethan reached for the handle, and opened it slowly. The rain had stopped completely. Outside, the world felt washed clean, the air crisp, the sky beginning to clear in soft shades of blue. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking lightly beneath his weight, and looked out across the quiet road. For a moment, he simply stood there, the letter in his hand, the past and present settling into the same space. Behind him, the house was no longer silent. It felt alive in a different way, not waiting anymore, but continuing. And somewhere deep within that quiet, Ethan understood that what had been given to him was not an ending, but a beginning he had not known he was ready for. The air outside carried a quiet clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the world had shifted slightly while Ethan stood on that porch, holding a letter that no longer belonged to the past alone. Ranger stepped out beside him, his paws landing softly on the damp wood, his nose lifting to the breeze, taking in the scent of rain-washed earth and something else, something lighter, like the promise of change. Ethan glanced down at him, then back toward the road that stretched empty in both directions. For years, that kind of emptiness had meant uncertainty, another place to pass through, another stretch of time without direction. But now, it felt different. Not empty. Open. He turned slowly and stepped back inside, the door closing behind him with a soft, steady sound. The house greeted him in silence, but it was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of something settled, something that had found what it needed. The old woman remained in her chair, though her posture had softened further, her presence quieter in a way that made Ethan slow his steps without thinking. He walked back toward her, the letter still in his hand, the weight of it now steady rather than uncertain. "This place," he said gently. "It was never meant to be kept, was it?" She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a calm that held no hesitation. "No," she replied. "It was meant to be continued." Ethan nodded slowly, the meaning settling deeper with each passing second. Ranger returned to the center of the room, no longer drawn to the floorboard, no longer focused on what had been hidden. That part was done. He lay down near the fire, his body relaxed, his watch now at ease. Ethan moved to the metal box and carefully gathered the contents, placing the journal, the letters, and the cloth back inside with a care that felt almost ceremonial. Not to hide them again, but to preserve them as they had been preserved for him. As he closed the lid, the faint echo of that soft, deliberate click returned, but this time it did not feel like something being sealed. It felt like something being acknowledged. He carried the box to the small table near the window and set it down where the light could reach it, where it could be seen, not forgotten. The woman watched him with quiet approval, her breathing slow, her expression peaceful in a way that did not need explanation. "You understand now," she said softly. Ethan looked around the room once more, taking in every detail, every worn surface, every quiet corner that held more meaning than it first revealed. "I think I do," he answered. Ranger shifted slightly, letting out a soft breath, his tail resting still against the floor. The house seemed to exhale with him, a subtle settling that carried through the walls and into the space beneath their feet. Outside, the clouds had parted further, sunlight beginning to reach the edges of the porch, creeping closer with each passing moment. Ethan moved to the window, watching as the light touched the ground where he had first stood, uncertain and alone. Now, that same place looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Behind him, the woman closed her eyes again, not in weariness, but in rest, as though her role in the story had reached its quiet conclusion. Ethan did not turn immediately. He knew, without needing to look, that something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And in that stillness, with Ranger beside him, and the house no longer waiting, Ethan understood that what had been given to him was not just a place, or a memory, but a responsibility carried forward from a kindness that had never truly ended. The moment passed so quietly that it could have been missed if Ethan had not been standing close enough to feel it, not as a sound, but as a gentle shift in the air, like the final page of a story turning on its own. He turned slowly from the window, his gaze moving back toward the chair where the old woman had been sitting. For a second, nothing seemed different. The light still rested softly across the floor, the fire still held its low, steady glow, and Ranger remained near the hearth, calm and watchful. But then Ethan saw it. Her hands, once lightly folded, now rested completely still, the faint motion of breath no longer present. There was no fear in the room, no sudden weight or sharpness, only a quiet stillness that felt like completion rather than absence. Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow, respectful, as though the space itself asked for gentleness. He knelt beside her, his eyes softening as he took in the peaceful expression on her face. There was no strain, no tension, only rest, the kind that comes after a long and patient wait. Ranger stood and moved beside him, his head lowering slightly, his presence calm, as if he understood that this moment did not need alarm or confusion. Ethan placed his hand lightly over hers, not to check, not to question, but to acknowledge. The warmth had already begun to fade, but the feeling in the room remained steady, almost comforting. He stayed there for a while, not counting the minutes, not thinking of what came next, just allowing the silence to speak in its own way. Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, slipping further into the room, reaching the chair, the floor, the edges of the table where the metal box now rested in clear view. It felt less like something ending and more like something being passed forward. Ethan rose slowly, his breath deep and even, his posture grounded in a way that had not been there before. He gently adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, a small act, simple and quiet, but filled with meaning. Ranger remained close, his tail still, his eyes soft, no longer searching, no longer alert to hidden things. That part of the journey had already fulfilled its purpose. Ethan turned toward the room, taking in every detail once more, the photographs, the worn furniture, the subtle marks of time that now felt less like age and more like memory held in place. His gaze settled on the box, and he walked toward it with steady steps. The light now touched its surface fully, reflecting softly, no longer hidden beneath the floor, no longer waiting in darkness. He rested his hand on it again, not with hesitation this time, but with acceptance. "I understand," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but to the space, to the moment, to whatever had guided him here. Ranger exhaled softly beside him, as if in agreement. The house remained still, but it no longer felt like it was holding anything back. It had given what it was meant to give. And as Ethan stood there, between what had been and what would come next, he realized that some endings do not arrive with noise or sorrow, but with a quiet certainty that something has been placed exactly where it belongs, ready to continue in hands that will carry it forward. The rest of that day unfolded without urgency, as if time itself had chosen to slow down in respect of what had just passed. Ethan moved through the house with quiet intention, each step measured, each action grounded in a sense of purpose that no longer needed explanation. He opened the windows one by one, letting fresh air move through the rooms, carrying away the last traces of stillness and replacing them with something lighter, something that felt like continuation. Ranger followed him from room to room, not searching anymore, not guiding, but simply staying close, his presence steady and certain. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted across the floor, filling the space with a warm, golden tone that softened every edge, every shadow. Ethan stepped outside briefly, standing on the porch once more, taking in the quiet road, the line of trees beyond, the open sky that now stretched clear and wide above him. It no longer felt like a place he had stumbled upon. It felt like somewhere he had been meant to arrive. When he returned inside, he moved toward the small table where the metal box rested. He opened it again, this time without hesitation, and took out the journal, flipping through its pages with a slower, more deliberate pace. Each entry carried a rhythm, a pattern of living that was simple but intentional, helping others, offering space, listening when no one else would. It was not about grand gestures. It was about consistency, about showing up in ways that most people overlooked. Ethan paused on one entry in particular, a short passage written in careful script. "The house does not belong to me. It belongs to those who need it next." He read it twice, letting the words settle fully. Ranger sat beside him, his tail resting still against the floor, his eyes calm, reflecting the quiet certainty that had replaced the tension from before. Ethan closed the journal and placed it back in the box, then reached for a small stack of folded papers he had not yet examined. These were different. Not letters. Documents. He unfolded the first one and scanned the text, his expression tightening slightly in focus. Property records. Legal transfers. Names that traced ownership of the house across generations, each one connected not by family alone, but by choice, by purpose. At the bottom of the final page, the space for the next name remained blank. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, the weight of that empty line settling into something real, something immediate. He exhaled slowly, folding the paper with care before placing it back with the others. "You were never meant to keep it," he said quietly, echoing her words from earlier. Ranger shifted slightly, letting out a soft breath, his presence unchanged, but his stillness now carrying a different meaning. Ethan stood and looked around the room once more, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who understood what had been left in his hands. Outside, the light began to fade, the sky softening into the first hints of evening. Inside, the house remained warm, steady, alive in a way that no longer felt mysterious. It felt right. And as Ethan stood there, with the box closed but no longer hidden, with the silence no longer heavy, he understood that the story he had stepped into was not finished. It had simply reached the moment where it needed someone willing to continue it, one quiet act at a time. That evening settled gently over the house, not as darkness falling, but as a quiet blanket drawn across something that had finally found its balance. Ethan lit a single lamp near the window, its warm glow filling the room with a steady, comforting light that pushed back the shadows without disturbing them. Ranger lay near the doorway, his body stretched out, his breathing slow and even, no longer alert to hidden things, but present in a way that felt complete. Ethan sat at the small wooden table, the documents spread carefully in front of him, the journal resting beside them, the envelope still bearing his name placed within reach. For a long moment, he simply looked at the blank line on the final page, the space where a name was meant to be written, not rushed, not forced, but chosen. The silence around him was not empty. It was expectant, like a pause in a conversation waiting for the right words to continue. He reached for a pen from a small drawer nearby, turning it slowly in his fingers, feeling the weight of something far greater than ink and paper. His mind moved through everything that had led him here, the miles of road behind him, the nights spent without direction, the quiet choices that had never seemed important until now. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching him, not urging, not questioning, simply present. Ethan lowered his gaze to the paper once more, the blank line no longer distant, no longer uncertain. It felt like an invitation. He placed the tip of the pen against the page and paused, just long enough to understand that this moment did not belong to hesitation anymore. Then, slowly, he wrote his name. Ethan Cole. The ink settled into the paper with quiet certainty, each letter clear, steady, final in a way that did not close anything, but opened something new. He leaned back slightly, the pen still in his hand, and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Ranger rose and walked over, sitting beside him, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words. The house remained still, but it no longer felt like a place holding memories. It felt like a place ready to hold more. Ethan gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the box, not as something to be hidden again, but as something to be kept with intention. He closed the lid gently, the soft click echoing once more, not as an ending, but as acknowledgement. Outside, the night had fully settled, the sky clear and wide, stars beginning to appear one by one, steady and distant. Ethan stood and walked to the door, opening it slowly. The air was cool, fresh, carrying the scent of earth and pine, the quiet rhythm of a world continuing just as it always had. He stepped onto the porch, Ranger beside him, both of them looking out into the stillness. For the first time in a long while, Ethan did not feel like he was searching for where to go next. He already knew. Behind him, the house stood quiet and warm, no longer waiting, no longer holding back, but ready. And as the night deepened around them, there was a quiet understanding that what had begun here would not end within these walls, but would move forward, carried not by chance, but by choice, one act of kindness at a time. Spring came quietly to the house, not in a single moment, but in small changes that gathered over time, the kind that only revealed themselves to those who stayed long enough to notice. The snow that once edged the road had melted into soft earth, the trees beyond the porch carrying the first hints of green, and the air itself held a warmth that no longer needed to be earned. Ethan stood outside one morning, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching as the early light stretched across the yard, touching the worn fence he had repaired piece by piece over the past weeks. Ranger lay nearby, his coat catching the sunlight, his ears flicking at the distant sound of birds returning to places they remembered. The house behind them no longer felt like a place of questions. It had become something steady, something lived in, something that breathed in rhythm with the days passing through it. People had begun to find their way there, not in crowds, not all at once, but one by one, each carrying their own quiet story. A man who had lost more than he could explain, a woman who needed a place to rest without being asked why, a traveler who stayed longer than he intended because something about the silence felt different here. Ethan did not ask for reasons. He did not need to. He offered what had once been given to him: space, time, a listening ear, a warm meal, a place where nothing needed to be proven. The journal remained on the table by the window, its pages no longer just a record of the past, but a continuation of something that had never truly stopped. Ethan had begun to write in it, not every day, not out of obligation, but when something felt worth remembering, when a moment carried meaning that deserved to be kept. Ranger had taken to sitting by the door again, not as a guard, but as a quiet observer, his presence a constant reminder that some instincts do not fade, they simply change purpose. On certain evenings, when the light faded just right and the wind moved gently through the trees, Ethan would pause and feel it again, that same stillness that had greeted him the first night, but it no longer felt like something waiting. It felt like something at peace. He would glance toward the chair by the window, now empty but never forgotten, and there would be no sadness, only a quiet understanding that some people do not leave in the way the world expects. They remain in the things they built, in the kindness they passed forward, in the choices they made that continue long after they are gone. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth settling into him as he looked out over the road that once felt endless and uncertain. Now it felt like a path, one that did not need to be chased, only walked. Ranger stood and moved to his side, leaning lightly against his leg, steady and familiar. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's back, his gaze lifting toward the horizon where the morning had fully arrived. There was no need for anything more in that moment. No grand conclusion, no final answer. Just the quiet truth that some things, once given with sincerity, never truly disappear. They find their way back, not always in the form we expect, but in the form we need. And as the light spread across the land and the house stood warm behind him, Ethan understood that he had never been searching for a place to belong. He had been becoming the place someone else would one day find.